The disorder is intolerable. It is incapable of justification. It's clearly racist, and it does not represent the modern, forward-looking Northern Ireland.
Keir Starmer's latest speech was a disaster, to say the least. He showed up in Northern Ireland, meant to address recent riots, and ended up branding nearly everyone as racist. People couldn't believe it. He looked strained, almost detached, as if the weight of his words was hitting him harder than anyone else. His remarks didn't just miss the mark, they ignited a firestorm of backlash, leaving everyone wondering if he's completely lost touch with reality. Is this the moment that finally brings Starmer's political career to its knees?
This man, not your security. You have failed me.
Thank you. Okay.
I've been a Labour voter my entire life. You have failed to be the opposition. You have failed to ask whether lockdown was functioning.
Keir Starmer's recent visit to Northern Ireland was nothing short of a disaster. And it all started with what was supposed to be a standard political meet and greet. He went there to talk to the police service of Northern Ireland's Chief Constable, John Bohr, and to meet injured officers and some folks from minority communities. You'd think he'd try to show some empathy or at least an understanding of the local sentiment, but instead, Starmer chose to go full steam ahead with a speech that rubbed just about everyone the wrong way.
I utterly condemn the far-right thuggery we've seen this weekend. Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force.
He didn't waste any time branding the recent riots and disturbances in Northern Ireland as racist and intolerable. It's like he was throwing accusations around without really grasping the reality on the ground. Sure, he likely thought he was standing up against intolerance, but what he did was make the people of Northern Ireland feel insulted and misunderstood. You have to wonder if he really knew who he was talking to, or if he even cared. There are few things worse than a politician who walks into a room and decides to lecture everyone without listening first.
I guarantee you will regret taking part in this disorder, whether directly or those whipping up this action online, and then running away themselves.
The way Starmer talked about the people involved in the riots was as if he'd already written them off as backward, hateful folks. It wasn't just a condemnation of the violence, he was framing Northern Ireland as a place still stuck in the Dark Ages. That sort of high-handed attitude doesn't sit well with people who feel they've been pigeonholed. Here's a place that has been through so much, with a complicated history and lingering tensions, and he acted like he could sum it all up in a few harsh words. It's no wonder that he got called out for being tone deaf. People want their concerns to be heard, not dismissed out of hand.
It was a Saturday in August when this hotel housing asylum seekers was targeted as riots spread across the country.
To be fair, Starmer was addressing real issues. The riots had shaken up the area, and the tensions around immigration and national identity were boiling over. But rather than showing any depth of understanding, he went for the most inflammatory language possible, calling the whole thing racist, like it was that simple. For many locals, his words felt like a slap in the face. It's one thing to condemn violence, but to suggest that the entire community is defined by racism. That's a pretty heavy-handed way of addressing a complex situation.
It's not racist to speak out about the huge numbers of people who are coming here illegally. It is not racist to want to stop the trafficking. It's not racist to want to stop the gangs. But
the backlash after Keir Starmer's comments in Northern Ireland was swift and fierce, and honestly, it's not hard to see why. His speech came off as a flat-out insult to the people there. When he called the recent riots and disturbances racist and intolerable, it wasn't just a critique of the violence. It felt like he was throwing the entire community under the bus. For many, it seemed like he was branding everyone involved as racist, completely ignoring the fact that their anger had roots in issues that go far beyond simple prejudice. There's a real sense of frustration among those who feel that their concerns about illegal immigration, are being brushed aside. Starmer's speech made it sound as if anyone who opposes open borders is immediately on the wrong side of morality. And that's a hard pill to swallow for folks who believe they're simply standing up for their community. To them, being worried about immigration doesn't make them racist. It makes them protective of their homes and values. But with the way Starmer framed it, you'd think they were all out there rioting purely out of hate. That kind of broad brush accusation set people off.
A sense that migrants get a better deal, given accommodation and food at taxpayers' expense. Mustafa also lives in the hotel and was there.
And it wasn't just the locals who were angry. Political figures, too, were quick to call Starmer out for being tone-deaf. He's supposed to be a leader, but in this case, he seemed more like a scolding outsider who didn't bother to understand the actual reasons behind the unrest. It's as if he took the easy route, lumping everyone together without a second thought. When you're dealing with a place like Northern Ireland, which has such a complicated history and deep-seated issues, you can't afford to gloss over the details. By doing so, Starmer not only missed the mark, but also risked alienating people who might have been open to dialogue. Starmer's words hit like a sledgehammer, and for many, they stung. Instead of addressing the underlying issues, like the fear of losing control over their communities, he dismissed those fears as something sinister. That's a pretty bitter pill for anyone to swallow, and it's no surprise that the reaction was so intense. When people feel like their worries are being painted as prejudiced, they're not going to just nod along politely. They'll push back, and in this case, they did so with a lot of anger. Starmer's approach seemed almost dismissive, as if he was more interested in scoring points than in actually understanding what was going on.
The hotel, we need burn the people in the hotel.
We first met Mustafa back in February.
Watching Keir Starmer during that speech in Northern Ireland, you could almost feel the tension radiating off him. Some people are even calling it a mental collapse, and honestly, it's hard to disagree. It was like he couldn't hold himself together, struggling to connect with the crowd or even make his words land. He seemed distant, almost like he was somewhere else entirely. Instead of addressing the people in front of him, he was just pushing through his talking points with no real emotion or understanding behind them. There were moments when he looked completely strained, as if the weight of what he was saying was crushing him. You could see it in his face, detached, weary, maybe even a little defeated. It was almost as if he was just going through the motions, barely holding on. People were hoping for some real engagement, something that showed he cared about their struggles. Instead, they got this robotic delivery that only underscored how out of touch he was. It's one thing to deliver bad news, but it's another to seem so disconnected that you come off as indifferent. His performance fueled the idea that he was losing his grip, both mentally and politically. It's like he doesn't know who he's talking to anymore. The whole time, he acted as if he was addressing a room full of strangers rather than people with deep ties to the community and strong feelings about what was happening there. That kind of disconnect can be a huge turn-off, and it makes you wonder if he even realised the impact his words were having. He was supposed to be reaching out, but instead, he just widened the gap between himself and the people of Northern Ireland.
Turn our attention to the UK. A brutal stabbing has shaken the nation. 11 children and 2 adults were stabbed on Monday in the town of Southport in northwest England. 3 of the children died. They were young girls, 6, 7 and 9 years old.
The recent immigration riots across the UK have exposed a dark and unsettling side to the country's ongoing social tensions. It all started with the horrific stabbings in Southport that left 3 young children dead and sent shockwaves through communities everywhere. The brutal attack was a wake-up call, but it was what followed that got people talking. In the days after the stabbings, riots erupted, bringing chaos and violence to the streets. People were furious, and it felt like the whole country was on edge. The anger boiled over into mass protests, with thousands taking to the streets, leading to hundreds of arrests. The sheer scale of the unrest was something else. Windows smashed, cars overturned, fires burning in the streets. You could see the anger and frustration pouring out, but it was about more than just immigration. This was a flashpoint, a moment when people's pent-up fears and resentments came spilling out. And amidst all this chaos, the rhetoric only got worse. Certain religious leaders, like that imam from London, took things up a notch by blaming the violence on Zionist conspiracies. He went so far as to claim that the riots were orchestrated by supporters of Israel, trying to paint Muslims as violent and barbaric. It was a dangerous move, throwing fuel on an already blazing fire.
So the Home Office gave him a room in the hotel. He doesn't want to show his face. There are other people who were born in Britain who are homeless, who haven't been given a hotel room.
The imam's inflammatory comments stirred the pot even further, and his words echoed throughout the media. He wasn't just pointing fingers, he was dragging the riots into an even murkier political and religious quagmire. It's one thing to be angry, but when leaders start using that anger to score ideological points, things can get very ugly very fast. His accusations weren't just wild, they were a blatant attempt to shift blame and distract from the real issues at hand. He painted the riots as a product of some grand Zionist scheme, which only served to deepen divisions and whip up even more hostility. This kind of rhetoric is dangerous. It takes an already volatile situation and gives people a new target for their rage. For many, it felt like he was justifying the riots, or at least deflecting the blame in a way that took the heat off those actually involved. But for others, his words were a rallying cry, something to latch onto in the midst of all the chaos. It's unsettling to think that, in a moment when the country desperately needed calm and unity, some chose to stoke the flames instead. Ashraf Dibus, an imam from a particularly controversial London mosque, recently made some eyebrow-raising claims about the riots, suggesting they were somehow fueled by Zionist conspiracies. According to him, the riots weren't just a reaction to the stabbings or immigration concerns, they were allegedly orchestrated by supporters of Israel, aiming to paint Muslims as violent and uncivilized. It's a pretty bold accusation, and it stirred up even more trouble in a situation that was already heated. For many, it seemed like Dibus was deflecting blame from the real issues at hand, using these wild claims to steer the conversation in a different, more divisive direction.
Of course. It's not our fault. They put me in that hotel.
Many here say they're more scared to go out since the riots.
You don't know who can.
These kinds of statements can really get people riled up, especially in the middle of such tense times. When Dibus threw out his accusations, it wasn't just a commentary, it was an invitation for more anger, particularly from those who might already be frustrated with what they perceive as anti-Muslim sentiment in the media and politics. His words felt almost designed to align with the anger that had been building up, especially following Starmer's remarks about racism. It's almost as if he was tapping into that frustration, giving it a different focus by suggesting there was a hidden agenda behind the chaos. For those who were already upset with Starmer for calling out racism in Northern Ireland, this idea of a Zionist plot added a whole new layer of resentment. But this isn't the first time that mosque has been in the news. Its head imam, Shakil Beg, has a history of controversy himself. Back in 2016, a High Court judge actually found him guilty of promoting extremist views, including endorsing religious violence. According to the judge, Beg's rhetoric could plant the seeds of extremism in young, impressionable minds, which is no small accusation. Despite that, Beg has remained a prominent figure at the mosque and in the local community. The mosque has even hosted school visits and received significant government grants, which is quite shocking given its controversial reputation. Beg's influence is still felt strongly there, and Dibus seems to be following right in his footsteps with these incendiary comments.